Please note this podcast discusses real-life crimes and may include sensitive topics such as violence, abuse, and other disturbing content. We recommend listener discretion.
It would have taken somebody very, very brave to have tried to intervene in that situation. When you've seen somebody being stabbed a dozen times, how brave would you have to be to step in?
I'm journalist Helen Fospero.
I'm crime reporter Martin Brunt.
And this is True Criminals.
A journey into the darkest corners of the criminal underworld with insights from decades of true crime reporting.
The stories behind the stories, plus exclusive interviews with those closely involved in notorious cases.
Re-examining crimes so shocking they still haunt our imaginations.
True Criminals Briefings.
Martin, you know I always like to ask what you've been up to as a crime reporter for Sky News, and one case I'd really like to ask you about has really resonated with me. I'm talking about the stabbings on the LNER train between Doncaster and London, and I suppose the reason that I've taken more interest than normal is that that's my line. I'm from Grimsby. My 16-year-old son was on that very train a week earlier by himself. My brother was on the same train the night before the attack happened, so it felt a little bit too close to home for me. Tell me about the case and what you did.
Well, I grew up in Cambridgeshire, so it resonated for both of us. I got a call from the news desk on Saturday night soon after the news emerged. I was watching telly at home and it hadn't registered with me, but it must have been before 10 o'clock and it was simply a plea for help from the news desk. Could I find out anything about it? Saturday night, people I called just didn't respond, and I wasn't surprised at that. So I went up there first thing on Sunday morning and joined colleagues who'd been working through the night. And they'd done a pretty good job of finding victims and witnesses. There was a pretty chaotic scene around Huntingdon station, as you can imagine. And I think pretty quickly the picture of what had happened began to emerge, that one or two knifemen had just gone on the rampage while the train was travelling south from Peterborough station. And a number of people had been stabbed. And I think already by early Sunday morning, we knew that 10 or maybe 11 people had been stabbed. Some were described as critically ill. And it sounded as though people were going to die. And of course, the reason that so many of me and my colleagues went up there was that the initial suspicion was it was a terror attack. And in fact, the British Transport Police and Cambridgeshire Police had launched what they called Operation PLATO, which essentially means that they trigger a response to a marauding terror attack. It doesn't mean it's terror. I suppose it means that it sounds and looks like terror. And it really puts all the emergency services on alert to respond to a major terror attack. What essentially it means, though, in practice, is that if you launch Operation PLATO, it means that all the emergency services, but for armed police, are told to hold back. They're sent to a rendezvous point near the scene of the crime, which was the train that had stopped at Huntingdon. But everybody has to wait until the armed police go in and deal with the situation, because if there's a marauding suspect on the loose with weapons, then that's not something that paramedics and fire brigade staff want to confront. So under this code Operation PLATO, it's the armed police who go in first and deal with the situation, make it safe for other emergency first responders to go in as well. So all of that was beginning to unravel by the time I got up there. My job essentially really is to talk to my contacts, try and find out what had happened, try and put some detail on what we didn't know really. I didn't find out a great deal other than to speak to, do you remember Chris Webb?
I do. We featured Chris Webb, didn't we, on the podcast?
Yeah, well, former head of media at Scotland Yard, who is now a crisis manager and advises on communications in crises and so forth. I didn't know at the time, but by the time I rang him on Sunday morning, he told me that he'd been up till 2 a.m. talking and helping British Transport Police, essentially in what messages that they wanted to get out. And how to control speculation and so forth. And of course, one of the issues here was that there was lots of speculation about it being a terror attack. And because we had descriptions of a black man as one of the alleged knife men, it fueled this madness on social media that this was an immigrant, perhaps even somebody who'd come over on a boat. And another example of the immigration policy leading to terrible crimes. In the end, of course, very quickly, police were saying that they didn't know it was terror. They didn't think it was. So a lot of heat was taken out of that social media frenzy. So I spent a couple of days up there, but I think as soon as the police decided that they were pretty adamant that it wasn't a terror attack, my role was diminished and I rather let other colleagues get on with 2 or 3 more days of covering what was still a very horrible crime. But again, very quickly, those who were on the critical list came off it and people were being released from hospital. So the impact was becoming diminished. Although, of course, I think even as we're speaking today, nearly a week after, there are still people in hospital.
Our podcast, True Criminals, is a year old. Thank you to all those on Patreon and to our listeners who followed us over the year and heard stories that have ranged from serial killers like Fred West and Myra Hindley to ongoing mysteries like the disappearance of Madeleine McCann and Lord Lucan, to robbers including Playboy thief Valerio Vice and Great Train mastermind Bruce Reynolds. As a Christmas special, we want to answer your questions about our previous episodes. Ask us anything you want and Martin and I will try to answer. Send us your thoughts to contact@audiobleachglobal.com. I think in all the initial confusion when there were reports of it being an attack by 2 people, everybody feared terror. And I felt a slight sense of relief when it was revealed that actually it was one suspect. So one suspect perhaps with some mental health problems. I'm not diminishing the attack. It must have been so frightening for everybody on board the train. And even for those who weren't injured, the fear of watching somebody go on the rampage with a knife. But I think there was a relief, wasn't there, that it was one person and not a terror attack involving more than one.
Yeah, there were some initial reports from witnesses that there were 2 knife men, and that did fuel the idea that it could be a terror attack. A terror attack in those circumstances felt more likely than one man going berserk. But you talk about trying to imagine the fear on a travelling train as well. People were pulling the emergency handle and nothing was happening. Now, in the old days, I'm told, if you pulled the emergency cord, as it used to be, the train would stop automatically. That doesn't happen now. The driver has to make a decision whether to stop or not. And when the first alarm was raised, the train was in the middle of nowhere. It had left Peterborough station. It wasn't scheduled to stop until Stevenage. So if it stopped immediately, it would have been in the middle of nowhere, perhaps on top of an embankment, perhaps there was wooded areas around. It would have made it very difficult for the emergency services to respond very quickly. The great thing that the driver did was to radio ahead to LNER headquarters, and they would liaise with the police, and the decision was taken to carry on to the first station that they could reasonably stop at, which was Huntingdon, which was maybe 10 minutes away. But even then, they had to coordinate the train off the fast-track line into a side platform at Huntingdon. So it wasn't a simple operation, but it was the right decision to make. And I was learning all this from talking to people like Chris Webb and others, which meant that I could then go on the air at Sky News and explain a lot of the detail of what had happened. And to begin with, just make the point that what the driver did was incredibly brave. Of course, afterwards, we learned another real hero was the train staff member who tackled the knife man and suffered appalling injuries. And I think as we speak, is still in hospital. Now, one of the things that I'm beginning to get used to, if you ever get used to it, is the kind of footage that's put on social media of just gruesome attacks. And I don't think anybody else has seen this, but a friend of mine was sent a video of the knife man attacking who we think must be that train worker. And it's the most appalling thing. He's stabbing him multiple times. And there are people sitting in the carriage, not watching this, but I think must have been frozen with fear, because it would have taken somebody very, very brave to have tried to intervene in that situation. When you've seen somebody being stabbed a dozen times, how brave would you have to be to step in? And that's video that, of course, we would never show on telly. But It's the sort of thing that more and more I'm seeing as these horrible crimes are committed.
And one clip I saw following this attack was the man they believed to be the knife man walking into a barber's shop to stab a 14-year-old, which begs the question, why had he not been caught?
Yes, another issue that emerged while I was still up there, before I went back to London, was these apparently linked incidents. So this stabbing of the people on the train happened on Saturday night about 7:45. But then it emerged that the night before there'd been 3 incidents, 2 around the barber's shop where a man with a knife had walked in threatening people but had gone away, and a 3rd incident where a 14-year-old boy was stabbed in the town centre in Peterborough. All of these were reported to the police, but the impression was that the police hadn't treated them as seriously as they should have done. Although they responded to each of those 3 incidents, they hadn't found a suspect, and it's difficult to know how much more of a search was carried on after that first call.
I realised I should have called you too, because, I host a lot of rail conferences, and I was called to be told that the fact the driver went to Huntingdon was a new safety mechanism that had just been rehearsed by LNER and Network Rail. So they'd put a lot of thought into what happens if there's somebody doing this kind of thing on board, and the decision they'd taken was not to stop in the middle of nowhere, but to try and reroute. And as somebody who's a mini expert in rail, that rerouting during that period would not have been easy, because the train wasn't supposed to stop at Huntingdon, and it's a very complex part of the network. So there were some real heroes in this, weren't there?
There were, and on that point about preparing for incidents like this as much as you can, one of the other things I reported, because somebody told me, was that a few months before, British Transport Police had had a tabletop exercise looking at how they would react to a situation just like this, which involved a train heading south from Peterborough station and somebody going nuts with a knife on board. So it was difficult to tell what lessons were learned from that exercise, but it must have contributed in some way, I think, to how things were dealt with on the Saturday night. And only a week before, there'd been some kind of terror exercise in that part of Cambridgeshire. So it just shows you that people are trying to prepare for these kind of terrible incidents all the time, and you like to think that they do learn something from doing those exercises.
And that gives us perhaps a little bit of comfort to know that there's a lot of effort going on behind the scenes that we very rarely hear about. But when incidents like this do happen, perhaps the authorities and police, etc., are better prepared than they might have been without those exercises.
Indeed.
Welcome to our new Patreon followers. Thank you for joining. Just to remind listeners, if you want to hear the episodes ad-free, you can. Head over to patreon.com/True Criminals. Stay with us for 3 months at Patreon and we'll send you a free True Criminals mug. Martin and I haven't even got one of those yet. Your support means everything to us. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to leave us a review. It helps us grow, reach new listeners, and keep bringing you the stories you love. This episode is brought to you by Audio Bleach Global. Our producer is Russell Barnes, with audio production by Andrew Chappell. The original score was composed by Chap Mannequin, artwork by Bleached, executive produced by Lee Mann. Follow True Criminals on Instagram @true.criminals and on YouTube at youtube.com/@true-criminals. For exclusive content and ways to support the show, visit us at patreon.com/True Criminals. For partnership opportunities, please contact us at contact@audiobleachglobal.com.